Imagine this for a second. A spiritual community, right? And they have rules so detailed, so specific, they dictate exactly how many donated items someone can accept, like down to the very last robe.
Yeah, it sounds almost bureaucratic, doesn't it? But that level of detail, it actually gives us this amazing insight into how ancient communities grappled with real-world ethics.
Yeah.
Especially when depending on, public generosity.
Totally. And that's what we're getting into today. Welcome to the deep dive. We are plunging into some ancient Buddhist monastic rules. Specifically, we're looking at how they developed ethical guidelines for receiving material goods, like robes.
Right. And our main source here is the Vinaya Pitaka, a foundational text for monastic life. We're zooming in on a section called Nissaggiya.
Our mission really is to see what we can learn from this about the practical side of things, building community trust, managing resources when you're supposed to be renouncing worldly goods.
And how these rules weren't just dreamed up in isolation. They often came about because of, actual problems, real situations, and how the public saw things.
So let's picture it. We're going back to ancient Savatthi. The Buddha's there, residing at Jetavana, this park donated by Vinaya Pitaka. Sounds peaceful, but even there.
Even there, human nature pops up.
Yeah.
Exactly. And the specific issue we're digging into started with a group of monks, the Chabbaggiya bhikkhus. They were, let's say, pushing the envelope a bit.
Pushing the envelope? How? What were they actually doing that got people talking?
Well, they'd go to lay supporters, the householders, and basically say, hey, some monks have shown up who've lost their robes, or the robes are unusable. The Akinakivaraka bhikkhus or Nahaikivarasa ones.
Okay, sounds like a legitimate need sometimes.
It could be, but the Chabbaggiya monks were asking for lots of robes, balkuviawat, even when the monks they were supposedly collecting for didn't actually need that many. Or maybe didn't need any new ones at all.
So they were kind of exploiting a loophole, misusing an allowance meant for genuine hardship.
Precisely. And people noticed. It wasn't subtle. Word got around.
How did the public react? Was it just quiet murmuring?
Oh, no, it was pretty open. The text says people were discussing it in assemblies, saying things like, look at these Sakyaputi ascetics. That's the Buddhist monks. Why are they asking for so many robes? It's way beyond the measure. They didn't think it was appropriate.
Beyond the measure. That's a key phrase, isn't it? It implies there was already an understanding of what was reasonable.
Absolutely. And the accusations got pretty pointed. People were saying it looked like they were engaging in Dusavanje, basically cloth trading.
Wow, like they were running a business.
Or setting up pagahe kasalo, like supply depots. It really shows how quickly that perception of greed could undermine the community's trust. A huge deal for an order relying on public support.
So this public criticism, did it reach the ears of other monks within the community?
It did. The text mentions monks described as apicca, those with few desires, the more scrupulous ones. They heard these complaints from the lay people.
And what did they think? Were they defensive or did they agree?
They were concerned. They also felt that the Chabbaggiya monks Namataya Janifa, they didn't know the measure, didn't understand the appropriate limits when asking for so many robes.
So even internally, there was a sense that this wasn't right.
Exactly. They thought it was damaging the reputation of the whole Sangha, the whole monastic order. So they did the proper thing. They took the issue directly to the Buddha.
Okay, so the complaint lands at the Buddha's feet. What happens next?
Well, the Buddha confirms the situation. He calls in the Chabbaggiya monks, asks them point blank, is this true? And they admit it.
No denial then.
Nope. And the Buddha expresses his disappointment. He points out quite directly that this kind of behavior doesn't exactly inspire confidence, especially not in people who are maybe new to the teachings or still unsure.
Right, it could actively turn people away.
Precisely. And this whole incident, this specific problem, leads directly to the laying down of a new sikkhāpada, a training rule. This is where Nissaggiya II comes from.
Okay, so let's get into the specifics of this new rule. How did it address this problem of asking for too many robes?
It was remarkably precise. The rule states, if an unknown householder, someone you don't have a prior connection with, spontaneously offers many robes.
Okay, so the conditions are important. Unknown donor, offering a lot.
Yes. Then the monk receiving them should only accept Santarudra Parama, basically, the maximum upper limit that's considered acceptable within the existing robe allowances.
And what was that limit? Was it just a vague, don't take too many?
Oh no, far from vague. This is where the almost mathematical calculation comes in. It was tied directly to the monk's actual current robe situation, specifically if robes were lost or unusable.
Seriously, like they had rules for different numbers of lost robes.
Exactly. If a monk had genuinely lost or damaged 3 essential robes, then from this specific type of offer, they could accept 2 new ones.
Only 2, even if 3 were lost.
Correct. If 2 robes were lost, they could accept only 1 new one from that offer.
And if only 1 was lost.
Then critically, if only 1 robe was lost or unusable, they couldn't accept any new robes from that specific offer by the unknown householder. Na kinichi sadidabai. Nothing should be accepted.
Wow, that is incredibly specific. Why go into that much detail, down to this single robe?
It really seems designed to remove any ambiguity, any wiggle room for exploiting generosity, doesn't it? It defines knowing the measure in the most concrete terms possible for this situation.
So it leaves no doubt about what's acceptable and what isn't in this specific case.
Right. And if a monk did accept more than this meticulously defined limit, Nissaggiya, it constituted an offense. A specific type called Nissaggiya pācittiya.
Nissaggiya pācittiya. What did that involve? What were the consequences?
It wasn't just a minor issue. There were actually 2 stages. There was pācittiya, a sort of preliminary wrongdoing just in the act of asking for too much, even before receiving.
Okay, so even the intention was problematic.
Yes. But the full offense, Nissaggiya, happened upon pācittiya, upon actually receiving the extra robe or robes.
And the consequences.
The robe itself, the one accepted beyond the limit, had to be forfeited. Nissaggiya, given up.
Given up to whom?
It had to be formally surrendered to the Sagasavagasava Pugalasava, meaning the monastic community as a whole, or a smaller group of monks, or even a designated individual monk.
And was it just handed over quietly?
No, there was a specific procedure. The monk had to make a formal declaration, acknowledging the transgression, and stating they were forfeiting the item because it was accepted improperly. It was a public act of accountability.
That really emphasizes how serious they considered this breach of conduct and trust. But, like most legal or ethical systems, were there exceptions? Situations where accepting robes wouldn't fall under this specific offense. An embatai, right? No offense.
Yes, absolutely. The rule was specific, but not without nuance. For example, if you thought the donor was unknown, but they actually weren't, and you asked for more, well, that was still an offense if you exceeded the limit. No excuses there.
Okay, so ignorance wasn't a total defense if you should have known better.
Right. But if you were genuinely uncertain, Vimatika, about whether the donor counted as unknown under the rule, there was no offense if you accepted robes. There was leeway for genuine doubt.
That seems fair. What were the main exemptions?
Key exemptions included robes received from yatakana, meaning your relatives. That was considered different.
Okay, family support was outside this particular rule.
Also, robes from Pavaratana people who had previously made a formal invitation or offered to provide requisites whenever needed. That pre-existing offer changed the dynamic.
Ah, like a standing offer. Makes sense.
And of course, if a monk acquired robes using atano danena, their own personal resources, maybe from before ordination or from permissible funds, that wasn't subject to this rule either.
Right, because it's not relying on unsolicited public generosity in the same way.
Exactly. There were also specific allowances for robes intended for someone considered umatakasa, meaning someone suffering from a severe mental disturbance. Compassion still applied.
And you mentioned something about a first offender.
Yes, the text mentions adikamikasati, which implies some leniency might have been shown to the very first person who committed this specific offense after the rule was made. Kind of a learning curve allowance, perhaps.
Interesting. Any other scenarios?
One more nuance. Imagine a monk is already bringing robes back from somewhere, maybe for themselves or others. If a donor then spontaneously offers more robes, but not specifically because they heard the monk was lacking robes or had lost them, then accepting those extra robes wasn't an offense under this rule.
So the reason for the spontaneous offer mattered. Was it trying to address a perceived lack or just general generosity unrelated to that specific lost robe narrative?
Precisely. The rule was laser-focused on preventing the abuse of that specific compassionate allowance for monks who had lost or lacked robes.
Okay, so let's pull this together, this deep dive into just one rule. Nissaggiya the Seventh, it tells us quite a bit, doesn't it?
It really does. We see a very concrete example of how a specific problem monk's getting greedy basically led to this incredibly nuanced ethical guideline.
And it really hammers home that idea of knowing the measure, that awareness of limits, avoiding excess, especially when you're in a position of trust and relying on others' goodwill.
And the huge role of public perception. The Sangha clearly understood they couldn't just ignore what the lay community thought. Maintaining that trust was essential for their survival and integrity.
Yeah, the level of detail in this rule feels like a direct response to protect that relationship. It wasn't just about monks being virtuous in private. It was about being seen to be virtuous and trustworthy in public.
It's a fascinating glimpse into the meticulousness of ancient monastic discipline. They were really trying to foresee and prevent potential abuses of generosity. Not just saying be good, but defining how, in very practical terms.
Right down to the number of robes. It's quite something.
And it leaves you thinking, doesn't it, about how communities today, any community really, spiritual or secular, formal or informal, how do we establish and enforce the measure?
Yeah, when it comes to resources or expectations or the trust we place in people who are supposed to be serving some kind of common good.
Or maybe, what's the modern equivalent of knowing the measure in our world? You know, a world overflowing with information, resources, possibilities, often instantly available. How do we navigate that ethically?
That's definitely something to chew on. A really good question to leave our listeners with today.